There we go. Perhaps the most uninspiring first part of a talk ever. So this is how to get a great Drupal job. Hope you're all in the right place. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what does a great Drupal job mean for you specifically? How does the recruiting process work? How are you going to get the interview? How are you going to ace the interview? What are you going to do once you get the offer? And then how are you going to make a great start at your new job? We're mostly going to focus in on what a great Drupal job means and what happens during the interview. Who am I? Why do you care? My name is Rob Huffstedtler. I am the director of our Open Solutions practice at ICF Olson. I've been doing this for about 20 years, web app development, content management, seriously involved in Drupal for about the last 6. And I've been involved in hundreds of job interviews over that time. And especially in this last year, I've done many and had a common frustration that kept occurring to me, which was having somebody in the interview who I had this gut feel that he or she was a lot more competent than they were representing themselves. But I didn't have any data that I could use to actually make a hire based on that. And I've learned not to trust gut feel unless you have evidence to back it up. I also reached out to some friends of mine, about 15 different people. Of those, about 12 said they would provide some information. And of that 12, about 4 actually got them in time for me to do this talk. I'm hoping that some other folks will provide feedback further along the way, and hopefully subsequent iterations of this talk will have more data behind it. So Chris Johnson, Zach Rosen, Christina Young, and Kyle Screenack all were kind enough to contribute some thoughts here. I have to emphasize, of course, that any contribution is their own opinion and does not represent the views of their employers. The same is true for me. Collectively, among the 5 of us, we made about 40 hires in 2016. Caution for you guys, the plural of anecdote is not data. So do not think of this as rigorous scientific information. Think of it more as the kind of advice that your uncle might give you over Thanksgiving dinner. What is a great Drupal job? I think each one of these people, this was the group photo from Drupalcamp last year, so some of you may be in this photo, I don't know. Each one of these people might have a different answer. Only a few things are universal for everyone. So integrity. Does the organization deal honestly with its employees, vendors, and customers? And is the organization ever going to ask you to compromise your own personal integrity in working with them? If they don't behave with integrity, they're not going to behave with integrity towards you, and you don't ever want to be in a situation where you're compromising your long-term career path by being involved with scoundrels. Yeah. Secondly, management competence. So can they articulate a vision for what their company does, why they do it, how they do it? And do they have the skills to actually put that into play? Often, especially in startups, you'll find that people have a grand vision, but they don't necessarily have the execution chops. They're going to make it all come together. And it can be very frustrating if you can't do your job because the people around you who are supporting you aren't doing theirs. And then financial sustainability. Does the organization have sufficient current cash flow to continue to operate? It's a lot easier to figure out if you're dealing with a public corporation or a nonprofit that has to do annual reports. And you have to figure out, do they have a plan for funding whatever strategic vision that they've outlined that doesn't rely on taking on loads of debt that they can't sustain? This again is a place where in the startup world, startups can be a lot of fun to work for, but you got to make sure that you can handle them coming in one day and saying, by the way, we can't pay you this week. Beyond that, I submit to you that the rest is personal for each of you. So I thought a little bit about what are the aspects of a job that would make a job great for me. At this particular point in my life, flexibility and location are probably the most important things. I have extensive responsibilities as a husband and father. So I need a job, and I have a kind of weird personal situation. I need a job that accommodates that and lets me work flexible hours, doesn't mind where I'm working from, and does all of that. There's other things that have stayed important over time, like I like jobs where I'm learning things. I like jobs where I feel like I'm working with smart people who are going to be able to teach me things. But there's other things that really are not that important to me. For instance, organizational size. There are other people who might say that they only want to work for small companies or they only want to work for big companies. For me, I've discovered that it doesn't have much of a difference in my sense of fulfillment. One I put way out here on the edge that we'll talk about a little bit more is availability. For me, a great job is not necessarily the job that I could go get right now. If you're restricted to the jobs that are available when you open up the classified pages, which no longer exist, of course, or when you go on monster.com, there's a good chance that there's not a great job for you just sitting there. So you need to be getting out ahead of this. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. The other thing is this is not really stable over time, as I sort of intimated. When I began my career, money and career advancement were much more important to me than they are at this particular phase. And I'm hoping that later in the next phase of my career, once the kids are out of the house, I'll be able to put more of an emphasis on social impact and work in areas that have impact on some particular causes that are meaningful to me. Another thing to emphasize is that great does not equal perfect. Since this is a Drupalcon, or camp, you'll notice the use of the PHP strict inequality operator. Even in any job you have, there's going to be things you don't like. For me personally, I hate our time and expense system. It is horrible. But it's a minor part of the overall job experience. So for me, it's not worth making an issue of. The key is to find a place where there are plenty of things that you love and few or none that you absolutely despise. As I mentioned earlier about availability, don't wait until you need a job to look for a job. If you only start looking for a job once you need a paycheck, availability is probably going to be the driving criterion. You can mitigate that somewhat with good personal financial habits so you don't have to rush and take something immediately. But even then, however much you have saved in your emergency fund is only going to carry you for weeks or months, not years. If instead you take ownership of your career, you can start having conversations today with potential employers before they even put a job description together. If you're especially fortunate, you can even help them shape that job description so that the job they offer is the one you want. You may not need to change companies to move from an okay job into a great job. Another managerial frustration I have is when I sit down with folks, and this has probably happened a dozen times over the last few years, who say, I'm not really happy, I want more out of my job, I want to advance. I'm like, okay, great, what do you want to do? And then you get the deer in the headlights look. If you can't tell me what you want, I can't help you get there. So, I have a homework assignment for each of you. Sometime this weekend, perhaps while you're sitting on the plane, for those of you who traveled in from afar, sit down and write a description of your ideal job. Don't think of it as much in terms of the way job descriptions are written by employers, but think of it in terms of, on a given day at this job, what would my life look like? When do I show up? How am I dressed when I show up? What's the first thing I do? What kind of people do I interact with? Which of my skills do I get to use? Are there things I absolutely want to not have to do there? As you can begin forming that up, then you'll have a much better sense of how you have a conversation, either in your current situation or with recruiters, where you can say, this is really what I'm looking for, and these are the things that matter. Segueing over to how does recruiting work? Actually, if any of you have questions, feel free to just shout them out.
Can you repeat that list again?
What shout out?
Which list?
The list of stuff that
What do you
Maybe you should
wear?
think about-
Stuff I don't want to do without listening.
Okay, I actually kind of riffed that one. That was improv.
You're fine.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Hit me again out there and we'll see if I come up with the same list or if it's totally different.
You're fine. Don't worry about it.
How does recruiting work? So recruiting always starts with a job description. And the manager's going to create that typically and hand it over to the recruiter. As you and I were talking about the other day while we were having lunch, I have a dirty little secret for you here. Managers are really busy. So the way the manager wrote that job description, he either copied the last one he used, or he went out on the internet to a competitor and found one that was very similar, copied and pasted that, and added the things that he thought were important. So then you end up with these weird job descriptions that include everything that no one could possibly do.
Yeah.
So don't be discouraged if you're not an exact fit for the job description. See if you can kind of figure out what things are genuinely important in it and which ones are probably leftovers. Once you begin conversing with the recruiter, hopefully you can start to tease that out. That's going to get posted on the company's own job board and on any number of job boards that they might use. I mentioned Monster, Indeed, etc. And they're also going to make their employees aware of it. So a good path in is referral. That's almost always your best path in. Once you have been noticed, either because a recruiter went searching for you on a job board or because somebody handed them your resume or you did the online application, you're typically going to have a conversation with a recruiter. The frustrating thing about talking to recruiters is that they have to represent the company across a huge variety of positions. They hire receptionists, they hire accountants, they hire technical people. So they obviously can't have deep knowledge about any of those things. Their level of knowledge is really dependent on how well the hiring manager has equipped them and how long they've been recruiting for this particular type of position. But the thing I think a lot of people fail to realize is that the recruiter is your friend. In this process, there is nobody other than you who is more invested in your success than the recruiter, because she or he wants to fill this position and move on to the next thing they have to do. And in some cases, they're being comped specifically on how quickly and how many positions they fill. So make sure you use them as an ally and get information from them in the process. What they're trying to figure out from you is, what is your general background and does it match the job description they've been given? Are you genuinely interested in the company? Are there any big red flags like you've changed jobs 5 times in the last 2 years? What are your expectations around compensation and start time? So essentially, if you can get through those things that they've just got to qualify, at that point you can start using them to get the information you need to qualify the company. Remember, this works 2 ways. They're trying to decide about you, but you're also trying to decide about them. In our process, and this was pretty typical of the other people I talked to, we then proceed to a tech screen by phone. There are some people who will have an actual automated test with something like Codility.com. I want to include that in our process, but we're not there yet.
What did you call that?
Codility, Codility.com. It's a really fun platform, actually, and I want to try it and see if it's going to have the predictive power that I believe it would, but it requires time, and like I said, managers are busy. So during the tech screen, at least for us, we ask a bunch of what I consider to be really easy questions, essentially to find out, did you fluff your resume or are you for real, and is it worth our time to spend more time with you? If you pass that, you'll go into the interview process, and this was the part that differed the most among people. A company like New Valley Media, almost all of their employees are remote, so almost their entire interview process is remote. For us, we like to get people into the office if they've passed the tech screen, especially if they're going to be a local employee at one of the offices. If it's one of our offshore resources, we typically still do the entire set of interviews by phone. What that looks like for us is typically 1 or 2 deeper technical dives, as an aside, I keep saying technical because the people I hire are primarily developers. The process is very similar for project manager, designer, or whatnot, but the kinds of questions you would be asked in the screen obviously would be different. Typically 1 or 2 deeper technical interviews, 1 or 2 interviews around how you're going to work with a team that would typically be conducted by another discipline. Like we might have a designer interview a developer to figure out, is this someone I can communicate with so that the work will get done? Have a project manager interview them to figure out, do they understand the things that drive project success, and so on. And the final one is almost always done by me, myself. And really, at the point in our interview process where somebody is handed to me, I've had 4 or 5 people say, yes, we want this person. So I'm no longer interviewing. We call it an interview, but at that point, really, I'm trying to sell the candidate on, here's why we think you want to be here. If we manage to get through that, then the company extends an offer. It differs from company to company how much discretion the manager has versus how much he has to work with HR to come up with a number and present it to the person. But then you have the opportunity to negotiate and to ultimately accept or not accept the offer. Where are employers looking? As I mentioned before, everyone prefers an internal reference because then you're not dealing with what we in the South refer to as a pig in a poke. You can actually see the capabilities of the person you are trying to hire. Job boards obviously are another source. No particular job board jumped out from the folks I talked to. I was very surprised actually that no one mentioned jobs.drupal.org or careers.stackoverflow.com. LinkedIn, recruiters who are actively recruiting will go find people who have a similar skill set to what's in the job description and we'll just call them up. Camps and cons, this is, I would argue, one of your best possible places that you could be. I've made some of my best hires from people I met at camps and cons, and I've seen lots of other people make connections that led to either working with someone as an employee or moving into more of a business partnership. And then, of course, there's external staffing agencies, which we've had pretty good success with when our recruiters have been unable to find good candidates, but it's highly variable.
And very expensive.
Yes. And the experience for you as a job seeker, here's where the recruiter can be a little bit less your friend. I've found that in a job seeking mode, sometimes when you're dealing with a headhunter, they will push you towards things that you're not really a fit for because they're so desperate to get the commission. I think that's very short-sighted on their part, but it's a field that has a lot of churn among recruiters. The good ones have been doing it for a long time. The bad ones have failed as a realtor and then jumped over to recruiting.
Or straight out of college.
Yes. Your resume is terrible. I haven't looked at any of your resumes, but I can tell you with almost 100% certainty that it's terrible. The good news is that mine is too. And there's a reason that they're terrible. A resume has to serve 3 totally distinct audiences. There are machines that are mining for keywords. So there's this, I got to put everything I know anything about on the resume so I get noticed. Then there's HR recruiters who are kind of looking for the same keywords and they've got a little bit more knowledge, but they still don't know what any of those things actually mean. And then you've got the actual interviewers who need to look at this thing. And if you've made it fit those other 2 audiences perfectly, you've got this monster stack of 10 pieces of paper that I'm like, I ain't got time for that. So it's really hard. They're at best, I think, a necessary evil. But you have to have one. Anybody know who this guy is since we're in Florida?
I'm going to guess from his tie, he's the Gators basketball coach?
Very close, University of Miami. This is Jim Larranaga.
Okay.
So when the University of Miami coaching job opened up in April of 2011, Larranaga was on the road. He was interested in the position. he knew who to call, but he didn't have his resume with him. And it became, we got to get this done quickly. So he went out to his Wikipedia page and he cut and pasted it and used it as his resume. I'm going to guess that would not work for any of us in this room. There is a link here on the next page. Given that resumes suck, what can you do to fix it? So first thing, customize it to the opportunity. Don't just keep one giant resume around that hits everything. Once you know what job you're dealing with, cut out all the stuff that's not relevant and really emphasize the things that are. Also, write a good, short cover letter. 2 paragraphs, narrative. Give me the elevator speech version of all the stuff that I'm too lazy to read that's in the resume. Make it as good as you can. That link there is from my friend Kyle Screenack. Resumes are much more important in the process at Duke than they are in our process. So I would trust his guidance there. A lot of people are going to check LinkedIn, so make sure you go there and fix the mess that is your LinkedIn profile.
Question.
Yes.
For somebody like me who I have skills, but I come out of retail and all that background, I haven't had a lot of design jobs yet. What would you say about what I put on my resume? Because most of my history of my jobs is crap.
Right.
Customize it for it, then she's going to have a resume that's a paragraph long. This is a problem too.
Yeah, I think in your particular scenario, or anybody who's trying to make a either major career change, or one of you I talked to the other day was not looking for necessarily a major career change, but a move from one part of the technical field to another. I think the best thing you can do is have a portfolio of some sort. Begin working towards having something that you can demonstrate. But even then, if somebody's looking only at the resume, it's going to be really hard to get noticed. So for somebody in your position, the most important thing you can do is build the personal relationships so you get the referral.
Do you know people who use like professional services to build
I have
CVs or LinkedIn pages?
I have never used one myself. I know that there are people out there. I don't think I've ever had personal contact with anybody who's used one. I
just used one last week. And the guy was a Harvard, Harvard MBA guy, blah blah blah. And what I got from it was that my old resume was more me explaining my, not short elevator pitch, but long elevator pitch. And his was more taking what I did and kind of keywording the hell out of it, to where it's got all these, and it sounds goofy. I mean, I really don't. I don't like it, but I don't have any expertise in resumes, so I've got to default to this guy. But but like you said, the problem is I literally sent him my resume and the job I was going for, and he customized it to that. Well, project manager job, but maybe a technical sales job. There's 3 or 4 different things that I'm looking at. I technically need to go back to him and have him, keyword for those. So I think that they may be valuable, but this is the second guy. I had another person who did the format of it, or the layout of it, and was very good at describing what employers are looking for, this and that, but they were completely different. So I would say, take it with a grain of salt, and I think what you're saying today is resonating more with me than what these online experts will have. Because if you take 5 of them, they're going to all have their own theory as to how you get hired and what the perfect resume looks like.
I think it's dangerous as well, is that if you use an external agent, in many respects, is that it doesn't necessarily reflect you.
Yeah.
And if you're going for a job, well, you have the lazy man option. Which here's everything that I've done,
right.
Hive it off to someone, they can slice it and dice it with their way, they regurgitate something, but it's actually not you.
Yeah.
So you're up against the, you can't get fit by just having a gym membership, right?
Right.
You got to do some lifting.
I'm concerned that I'm going to sit down with in an interview with this resume, and they're going to be reading it and saying, "What do you mean by this?" And I'm saying, "I don't know what I mean by this." I didn't write it. Because I've read it, and it's very, it's almost like it's keyword, it's really really crazy writing. So you know,
He's really optimized it for the machine, not for the human.
Optimize it for the machine to get past that first stage of the you know the process. But then beyond that, I mean, you need to be more human, and I guess that's the.
Need two resumes.
Yeah.
One page and then one
Yeah,
short elevator page.
Like you two words for every job, for every position that you go for, unless it's the same thing.
Yeah.
A marketing specialist and a marketing manager are two different things. They do different things, so you have to highlight those. And then if you have things like I did software sales, well, that's not marketing. So I mean, in essence, you just have to get rid of those. So this is the hardest part of finding a job is you know identifying who you are and what you can bring to the table to get the opportunity to do it.
Absolutely.
It comes back to what you said about when you fly home, sit down and write down your ideal job.
Right.
Well, and that goes to, I mean, gotta remember the title of this. This is how to get a great Drupal job.
Yeah.
This is not how do I get a job.
A job. Yeah.
Would you take out pieces of the resume in order to get into a specific Drupal job, or?
You have to tailor it.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. There's one thing to the lazy man comment. For about 10 years, I used to work with a protocol called DICOM, which is used for digital imaging and communications in medicine. It's the protocol that sends X-ray studies, radiologic studies of various kinds, from the acquiring mechanism to the storage mechanism. And I had left that on there, and it's such a niche skill set that like 10 years since the last time I used it, people were calling me about it. Turns out it's actually content management, but that's a whole nother story for another time. So some stuff I had to get rid of just to stop getting the calls I didn't want. You know, and I've had people call me for SharePoint because I've got a little bit of SharePoint experience on there, but you do not want me touching your SharePoint site.
Right. It's been 15 years since I've done some things, but I put them on there. But yeah, if you start asking me, they're 4 versions newer than they used to be before. So yeah, I mean it's.
So moving on, what are hiring managers looking for? Anyone have any thoughts?
Someone who knows everything.
Unicorns.
Unicorns.
I think to some degree you're right.
Son of the Fountain?
What stood out to me was that there was no secret sauce. And everybody I talked to, which admittedly it was 4 people plus some internal people, no one had like the thing that makes somebody the perfect employee. It turns out the employer's needs are just as unique as yours are. Teamwork and flexibility both came up a lot, but even those weren't universal because what some people need is somebody who is just going to work remotely, go into Jira, take some tickets, bang them out, and they don't care if they ever talk to him. But other people want somebody who's going to come in and, you know, they're also looking for, is he going to be a good player on the softball team? You know, we really need a shortstop. So yeah, those guys across the street are beating us every season.
I can throw a spiral football.
So all that said, how can you stand out from the crowd? In my opinion, almost nothing beats a good D.O profile. And I thought it was so funny that Mike had his rant yesterday, and I actually agree with him 100%. But keeping in mind that I mostly hire developers, the fact that non-developer contribution is not really well reflected there doesn't hinder me as much as it would somebody who is hiring a designer. I'm sure there are sort of equivalent places where you could highlight what you've done. But within our community, this is the best we've got right now. This here is Joe Schindelar's profile. I don't know if any of you know him, but he's a real solid guy. And I asked him if I could brag about him, and he said absolutely. So, yeah, from a quick look at this, you can see that Joe is deeply involved in the Drupal community. He's been to cons and camps. You can see that he has, even though he's not primarily a developer, he's actually primarily in education. He's been very involved in the issue queues within the last year. He has done a lot of other work. He's written tests, he helps in the forums, he's written documentation. 17 people list him as a mentor. I think that's very helpful. Anything that shows me that other people respect you really gives me a vote of confidence. And by clicking the posts and commits, I can get a pretty good sense of, is this somebody who can communicate well in written form? Is this somebody who can, in an issue queue, have a meaningful disagreement with people that actually adds value as opposed to just being obstinate. So one of the first things I do when we get a resume is I ask the recruiter to go back and find out the person's D.O username and their GitHub username and their Stack Overflow username. I come up dry, I would say 70% of the time. It's really surprising to me how many people have nothing out there. So just knowing that, that's a way that you can get ahead of 70% of the people just by minimal effort.
But then the other flip side as well is that you can do, my English is getting worse. You do have then, okay, you create these placeholders, but unless you actually maintain them, that's not actually good either.
Right.
So 6 of one, half of them doesn't know the other.
Drupal.org seems there's too many alternatives to keeping that profile. I mean, I think LinkedIn is kind of migrating to that. And if LinkedIn could do something that would auto-populate or connect to Stackflow, that type of thing, I think it'd be actually a good value for them, because I think they default people go to LinkedIn. A lot of times you find connections through LinkedIn initially. So I agree with that. So I went and worked on my bio page, but it's not impressive, And
there's a challenge there that I think is a little bit broader, and I don't even know who. Somebody in the association would have to tackle it, and I feel like it's one of those questions that just sort of swirls and never makes any progress. Because you're seeing some good movement on things like contributor credit for things other than commits. But even on commits, there's a lot of projects that are moving off to GitHub, and they basically only check into D.O once they've got a release ready. I kind of favor the model of where there's stuff out there that works well, let's integrate with it rather than try and replace it. But I have no influence. So, I mean, other than my vote on who's going to be the association at large person, I don't think I voted. So,
doing the sprints now soon, and start doing things on core and commit different things. You're saying this page in Drupal.org, which will be automatically populated, would create a big advantage.
Yes, absolutely. So, moving on. How do you prepare for the interview? I will share another secret with you. You probably all hate interviewing. You know who hates interviewing as much as you do? The person across the table. Mm-hmm. Why is that? A big one is that in most cases they haven't been given any training at all for doing it well. And unless it's an organization that's making a lot of hires, they may not have had to interview in a while. They have a couple of fears. They wonder, are you telling the truth? Are they missing something big? Are they going to forget to ask something? You're going to get hired, and then they're going to wonder, why did I do this? And are you wasting their time? That's a big one. You can help them out if you come prepared and make the process easy for them. To do that, step 1, do your research. Make sure you know plenty about the company. Look at their website. Real world example here. Let's say hypothetically I was going to look at a job with Lullabot. First thing I would do is hit their about page. They've got a great video there. If you watch that, you would come away with a real sense of who they are as an organization. Whether you were a job candidate or a prospective business partner, I think it would be a good place to look. Most people don't have that high quality of information, but still something to look for. If any of their work is publicly accessible, check it out. This is one of the places where agencies and consulting groups, they tend to brag a lot about the stuff they've done, so it's pretty easy to get a look at what they've done. See if they have any blog posts or talks that you could read or watch. Again, Lullabot, you have no excuse to not know everything about Lullabot. Check out company reviews and salaries on Glassdoor.com. This is kind of the flip side. The stuff that works really well for big employers tends not to work well for small employers and vice versa. So my company, we have a ton of reviews out on Glassdoor. I would say it's a little bit variable in quality because we have a lot of different divisions, and the experiences of people within ICF differ a lot from division to division. So you have to be mindful of that both ways. If you're checking out a small company, you're probably not going to find much at all on Glassdoor. Check, see if there's any information about them on Wikipedia or on Google News. Again, works better for big rather than small. Then check LinkedIn. See if you know anyone who works there now or who has worked there in the past. In the case of Lullabot, it turns out that I met a bunch of people at camps and at Drupalcons. So if I were going to apply for a job there, before I even did the application, I would call some of those people and say, what is it really like to work there? What are they really looking for? Are there particular people I should be trying to connect with outside of the formal interview process? Then, we're going to assume you've gotten the interview. Show up early with your stuff. Get plenty of sleep the night before. You want to be sharp, exactly. But you don't want to over-caffeinate. I have a funny story about a friend here that I do not have time to tell. I almost did not put this third bullet on there because really, if you need to be reminded of this, I don't want you working for me anyway. But be kind and professional to everybody in a 10-mile radius of the interview. You do not want to walk in and realize that the guy you cut off in traffic is now sitting across the table from you. What works a lot better is just be kind to everyone. Be a decent human being. You can do it. Bring a copy of your resume, because if I'm interviewing you, guess what? I forgot it. Bring samples of your work if possible. This is especially key if you're employed somewhere where your stuff is not public and they can't just see it. Or if you don't have a lot of code samples from commits up on D.O, because everything you've done is private, but you can't really share it, but you could turn the laptop around and talk through how you implemented something. The interview itself consists of essentially 4 types of questions. There's what I call the getting to know you questions, technical questions. Again, if you're interviewing for a project manager job, it's not going to be a technical question, but it is going to be a question specific to your discipline. Behavioral questions, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then the oft-neglected your questions. Samples of each of those coming up. Tell me about yourself. The purpose of this question is to give you a chance to relax and get comfortable in the interview setting. It's also a tactic for the interviewer to buy a little time so they can shuffle through their stuff and see if they did in fact bring the resume that they probably forgot. And to remind themselves, who is this person that they're talking to? Because the reality is they probably were in a meeting right before this and have just had to run down the hall, use the restroom, grab a cup of coffee, and they're already 3 minutes late by the time they step in the room. Main goal. Be concise. No more than 4 or 5 sentences. Highlight your relevant experience, your key strengths, and why you think this is an interesting job that you would like to talk about. Another getting to know you question. How much do you know about us? 90% of the people I interview have a bad answer to this question. You have no excuse to show up for an interview and say, not really anything. So remember all that research that we did before? This is your chance to show off that you've done it. Be concise, but demonstrate that you understand what business the employer is in, any particularly interesting work they've done, and why you're interested in working there. Now some technical questions. This one is one of my standard technical screen questions. Anybody who's been around Drupal for 2 or 3 weeks ought to be able to answer this question. So if you flub this one, chances are I will politely fill up the rest of the half hour and then say, no, we don't need to go anywhere. Good answer would give 1 or 2 sentence concise definition of the concept and some sample use cases. So the best use cases are the ones where you can talk about how you particularly have used it. You might say, on the XYZ project, I created a view to provide a list of all the classes taught in the health club. If you want to take that to the next level and give a great answer to this question, get to more specificity and show that you're keeping up with the latest trends. Obviously only if this is true, but for example, you might say, I'm currently working on adding a REST export display to supply the same results to our mobile application. Then we have a deeper question. Usually I will save this one for the one of the deeper technical interviews. Tell me everything that happens from the time you click a link in a browser until the returned page finishes rendering. This is one where, and obviously I wouldn't use this with a site builder or a project manager, but this is the kind of question where detail and specificity are the winning combination. I've had a handful of people get with this one all the way down to the level of talking about how address resolution protocol helps get the TCP/IP packet from the physical adapter on the box over to the router.
That's pretty low.
That's pretty low.
But the word says everything.
Yeah. Hey, if somebody says that, I'm like, okay, we're on a good track. You can stop. I don't need all the details. If somebody says Drupal gets the request and renders it and sends something back, I'm like, we need to go a little deeper on pretty much all of those. What I'm really after with this one is trying to get a sense of whether the person knows enough about how the internet works that they could debug a non-trivial issue that arose from something like DNS configuration, the presence of a front-end cache like Varnish, a load balancer issue, misconfiguration of Apache, a database issue, an error in the settings.php, all those things that are not the core of development, but there are things that actually cause estimates to take forever. This is a behavioral question. Any question you have that starts with "tell me about a time" is a behavioral interviewing question. It is, at least the last time I looked at any actual research, the only form of questioning that has been proven to have high predictability of whether or not somebody is going to be a good hire. Unfortunately, most interviewers don't use it, but you can still structure your answers as if they did. For instance, if instead of this, someone asked, "Do you ever do estimates as part of your current job?" You could answer yes, give a short specific example, and ask them if they wanted you to go into more detail. Key things to know about dealing with these kinds of questions. Relate your answer to specific examples from your actual work history. If you don't have specific examples from your work history, then explain that, but proceed to give as good an answer as you could based on a hypothetical. I try to make sure I don't give questions that people wouldn't have run into. Like, can I assume that everybody in here has missed an estimate at least once? Okay.
Can you find somebody who's actually hit an estimate?
Right. If somebody tells me I've never missed an estimate, I'm like, yeah. Bye. Also, make sure that your answer, especially if they allow you to go deeper, includes some real analysis and shows that you know what you can control, what you can't, and how you deal with that. Like, it is very realistically possible that the reason you missed your estimate was the BA didn't give you all the details. You don't want to come across as blaming, but you do want to affirm that. However, knowing that if you work with that same BA again, what are you going to do that's going to keep that from happening? Do you have any questions for me? Probably my most important question. If somebody does not have a question for me at the end of this, I assume that they're really not that interested in the job. Or if they ask really crappy questions. We'll get to those in a second. Good things to ask about here, as long as you couldn't answer them from a quick Google. What's your methodology? What do you do to contribute to the community? What is your retention rate for people in this position? What's a typical day at work like for somebody in this position? And the biggest one, if you hire me, what do I need to do over the next year to make you successful when you get your job review? If you show that you're thinking about what's going to help the hirer succeed, she will love you. Dealing with bad questions. Trivia questions. We all remember when Microsoft was asking bogus stuff. I have a friend, he works at a large statistical company, which shall not be named, who he kind of likes these because he thinks they show problem-solving skills. I question whether that's true. I can give you a specific example later. If I got one, I think what I would do, I'd do my best at answering it, but then I would try and say, what are you trying to get at with that question? Perhaps if you can explain what you're looking for, I can give you a specific real-world example that demonstrates the same skills. Then we have inappropriate questions. I'm speeding up a little bit because we've got like 2 minutes here. Do you have kids? Where are you from? these are the kind of things, again, most people haven't been trained in interviewing. If you've done your research, you're hopefully not interviewing any place where there's going to be a real risk of conscious discrimination or whatnot. So this is probably just somebody trying to forge a human connection. So if, all caps if, you feel comfortable, go ahead and answer it. If you don't feel comfortable answering it, then politely evade it by saying something like, I'd prefer not to talk about personal matters at this point in the interview process. What you don't need to ask. Don't ask how many days of vacation you get, when you're going to be eligible for a promotion, basically anything that makes it seem like your only interest in the job is financial, or that you might be looking for a job where you can just coast. So, some of these are important questions. The person to ask them to is the recruiter. Once you've gotten far enough into the process that even with the recruiter, this should not be your first starting point. This is once you've learned enough about the job that the job itself is interesting, then clarify whether it's going to pass all your gates for it to be realistic for you. What happens after the interview? Send thank you emails. Almost nobody does it. Better yet, actual thank you notes. I've never gotten one. I've sent many. Follow up with the recruiter and the person who referred you. Thank them personally on the phone. Do your research so that if you get an offer, you know how to respond to it. Again, go back to Glassdoor. See, what does this company typically pay for this position? What does this position typically earn in my area? So that you're not just pulling numbers out of the air. If you get an offer, negotiate. They probably did not start with their highest figure. Other things other than salary are sometimes negotiable, like how much you have to come into the office. You figure out what's important to you, ask it, and hopefully you get as close as you can. If you didn't get an offer, ask for advice on how you could improve as a candidate. A lot of people won't give you any answer because of fear of litigation, but again, if you've got somebody who referred you, you probably can get some back channel communication that will help. And then continue cultivating relationships with the people you met. If this is really a place you wanted to work, these are probably going to be people you like, and you might as well continue to get to know them because there's going to be other opportunities in the future. How do you make a great start at the new job? I typically hate long word vomit slides, but Chris Johnson gave such a wonderful answer that all I could do is remove a few details because it's chock full of meat. So I'll read it in its entirety. Expect to be overwhelmed. We throw a ton of information at someone in their first weeks. We don't expect them to memorize it. We just want them to make sure they know it's available. Ask plenty of questions. Learn who people are, what they know, who you can go to with particular questions. Take advantage of the opportunity to be new. Ask people to show you how things work, but demonstrate that you've put some effort into understanding and are looking for confirmation rather than needing everything spoon-fed to you. Make sure you're getting feedback about your work. Is the pace and quality up to expectations? Are you using techniques that are appropriate? Are you checking in with your technical and project leadership early enough and frequently enough? If you want to keep talking about this, we actually don't have to worry about the Genius Bar because nobody's got the room next. I can stand around and talk as long as you want. If you're tired of talking and want to code, or review, or test, or document, sprints are right down the hall. If you go sprint, you'll meet some people. It will lead to maybe having some job opportunities. Go sprint. Image credits. Thank you all very much.